It's a session sponsored by the EEA Research Committee. I've been chair of this up to now, and Estelle Cantelon will start being chair from now. The background to this session is that we, together with the core project, we put together a book published over this last year on called Economics Without Borders, and it's a kind of manifesto for coordinating research cooperation in Europe. And one big idea out of that the research committee has taken on is that Europe will be a powerhouse for data, and that we can do a lot better than we're currently doing by coordinating on the different types of data and different types of questions you can answer with it. So this session is bringing together 4 leading experts on different aspects of administrative data, big data, research designs with new data sources. And they're just going to talk about their experiences and some ideas in that field. They've got 12 minutes each, counting down, and then we've got 10 minutes at the end for a kind of panel discussion. So leave all questions, apart from really urgent clarification, till the end, and we'll have as much time as we've got for a debate. So we're going to run in the schedule as it is in the booklet laid out, where we've got Miklos Koren first off, then Caterina Calsamiglia, we've got Magne Mogstad, and then finishing up will be Andrea Weber. Then we'll have as much time as we've got left for a general discussion. So Miklos, you're kicking off. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. So I'd like to talk about one particular type of data that is actually very, very common in observational data, that is multidimensional transactional data. So what are these transactional data? Many observational data in administrative data sources or in business data sources are transactional, and these are basically repetitive, very structured data. So you have a lot of repetitions of the exact same structure happening over and over again and being recorded. So in administrative data, examples could be customs declarations or tax declarations like VAT or sales tax declarations, or even wage reporting at a monthly frequency could be thought of as transactional. In business, this is everywhere basically. Whenever you make a sale, you're basically making an entry in a transactional database. Or even whenever you visit a website, you're going to have an entry in a website log. It records your IP address, what page you visited, and so forth. So all of these are transactional data, and this is what I would like to talk about today. So in the business intelligence parlance, people think about these data in the so-called star schema, and I'll tell you a little bit why it's called a star schema. But so such data have many dimensions and typically few facts. So what is a dimension? A dimension is an attribute of the observation that identifies the observation. So in the sales data, it might be which salesperson made the sales, to which client, what region, what product was sold. So typically, these are categorical attributes. Okay, with some other examples that I'm going to talk about later. And a fact is something that you know about the observation, so something that you can use to characterize the observation, the amount of sale, the quantity, whether there was any sales discount applied, and so forth. Okay? And so the typical setup is that you have many more dimensions than facts. And this is exactly why it's called a star schema, because if you represent this data in a relational database, you have a central table recording the facts. So in this case, the dollar amount of sales or the number of units that you have sold. And you have other tables in your relational database corresponding to the different dimensions that you're interested in. And if you have many dimensions, you're going to refer to many other tables, and it's going to look like a star. Okay, so that's why it's called a star schema. Now, this is how an engineer would look at the problem, or how a business intelligence expert would look at the problem. But how would an econometrician look at the problem? And an econometrician's representation might look like this, right? X is a fact, and there are all these indices, and I just added a lot of indices to signify that there are typically many dimensions. Okay? So what to do with this? Let's look at a couple of real-world examples, and I brought administrative data examples. There are plenty of business examples as well. So product-level export data collected from customs declarations, or VAT declaration data from Belgium, or public procurement data from Hungary. These are the three examples where I can give you some numbers to highlight the actual, sometimes computational, but often conceptual issues that arise with these kind of data. So product-level exports. What's a transaction in this data set? So if you're an exporter in the US, you have to fill in a customs declaration. Of course, you do it electronically, but every line you enter of what product you're exporting to where is going to be an entry in this database. Okay? And in 2005, there were 22 million entries in this database. Okay? So 22 million observations or transactions, if you like. Now, what are the dimensions? Among other dimensions, it contains the product code that you are shipping. There are about 9,000 of these different product codes. The identifier of the firm who is shipping. And in 2005, there were 160,000 exporting manufacturing firms. This is for manufactured exports only. That were active in this database. This transaction can happen on any of the 365 days of the year, and you have many destination countries that you are shipping to. In the confidential data, you also see actually who you are shipping to, and then it actually gives you more dimensions because you see the buying party as well. But even with this product and country level data, you have 100 trillion different types of combinations of these dimensions. Okay, but of course, most of these combinations are empty. There's no transaction happening in 99. Basically, the best prediction is that no one exports anything anywhere. What about business-to-business transactions in Belgium? I think this is a fascinating data set. And the basis of observation is partner-specific VAT declarations, of which there are about 15 million per year. And exactly because this is firm to firm, one dimension is the selling firm, the other dimension is the buying firm. They have roughly the same number of firms on each side. And so your combination of these just two dimensions comes out to like 7.3 trillion different combinations of these two dimensions. Again, a lot of zeros in the data. Or public procurement, which is something actually much smaller because it's really just a smaller segment of the market. It's 20,000 observations per year in Hungary, averaged across the past 10 years. But we know a lot about these tenders. We know their product codes, these 9-digit product codes, about 6,000 of them. We know which firm or public agency was buying that product. There are about 8,000 of them. Which selling firm, which firm was the seller. And only the ones that are actually having some transaction data, they are already 24,000 of them. So if you add all of these, multiply all of these, you have 400 trillion potential combinations of the categories. And again, an insane number of, or fraction of zeros. My state actually told me that it's 100%, but I wanted to show that it's not 100%. Okay, so what do we do with this? How do we model these kind of data? And I think the most common approach is to think about dimensions first, and so basically relegate dimensions in the index and kind of model what happens in each dimension. Not necessarily independently across dimensions, but definitely the dimension is your starting point of modeling. And the reason why it's traditional to do this way is typically at least one of these dimensions is the decision-making agent. Firm I is entering this database, so it's totally sensible to build a statistical model of what firm I doing. I think the problem is that there are all these other dimensions in there. And so, of course, if you are working in multidimensional panel data, this is what you're working on. And there are many people in this room who are doing this. Now, what I would like to advocate for this in this talk, actually, is to think about a way to model transactions directly rather than thinking about each of the dimensions separately. So in this way, basically, you're thinking of a transaction and you're asking, which category does it fall into? Okay? Again, maybe independently across transactions, maybe not, but you have to think about the transaction and model that. It may be a bit artificial split because, of course, you can walk back and forth between the two ways of modeling, but just to organize thoughts, I think this is a very useful device to think about these terms. So what are the challenges if you don't think about the transactions? There's basically too many dimensions, and I try to kind of get that idea across from these numerical examples. Too many observations, too many zeros, and often too many fixed effects to estimate. Kind of a special case is some of the dimensions might be continuous, and then what do you do? What do you do with them? So what if there are too many dimensions? If you really say, for example, you want to include fixed effects because you want to care about heterogeneity across firms or across countries or products, it can become challenging. Although if your data is completely balanced, then you can do within transformations that take care of that. Obviously, too many observations, they just don't fit in our computer, and then we're gonna, of course, people work with big data, but I wonder how many of you have worked with data sets of trillions, hundreds of trillions of observations, and I'm willing to bet that not many in this room have done that. So common approach in this case is to just select a subset of the data, either a random sample, which is good, or some ad hoc sample, but then we don't really know what we're doing in terms of statistical properties. What I have already alluded to, it is 99.99999%, is that there's too many zeros. So if you want to model these outcomes, and a good chunk of them are zero, you typically have to think about a multi-level model, and it can get complicated to estimate if you have many observations, especially if you also have a lot of fixed effects to estimate. Okay? And again, if you have too many fixed effects, it's a problem, especially if you combine with some multi-level modeling. It's quite challenging. And a kind of a special case is for continuous dimensions like time and space. And we often think of them as continuous because in the data we have monthly observations or annual. But these are really just arbitrary aggregations of the continuous dimension. And so often what we do is just, okay, let's just discretize. So I have like daily data in my customs statistics, but I don't really care about daily transactions, so why don't I aggregate up to a year? But then it's quite arbitrary, why a year, why not a month? And if I do a month, I'm basically multiplying the number of observations by 12. And again, we're going to be running into the number of observation issue. So what can we do if that is the case? Basically, what I'm advocating is think about the transaction rather than trying to guess if that particular firm to that particular country and in that particular product, in that particular day of the year, whether they had a transaction. Actually, the best answer is no, they did not. But if you think about a transaction, a firm is sending a shipment abroad. Which country does it send it to? Which partner they're going to interact with? It might be a more complicated model. You might need some discrete choice model like a multinomial model, but you have much fewer observations to work with. Inference actually can be quite simple in these models if your null model is relatively simple. So we have an example of what we call the balls and bins model, where we're just really tossing balls into the bins characterized by countries and products in the customs data, and it's very simple to simulate what would happen under this null model, and you can see whether there's any relative to that null model your estimates are outside any confidence interval that you want to draw. And for prediction, I didn't really talk about prediction. I suspect that if you have 99.9999999% of zeros, it's very hard to make good prediction in that type of data. But with thinking about multinomial And I'm just thinking here that probably empirical base can be a way to go there, because it can deal with these missing observations that have not yet happened in the data and might predict that they will in the future, could perform better. So my conclusion, my takeaway from this is that transactional data is everywhere. It's great. I love working with this kind of data, but they tend to be very sparse, lots of zeros, and so be careful when you touch these data, and always think about not only the economic model that might have generated the data, but also the data model that if I have 22,000 observations, how could these observations have come about? And let's try to model observations rather than the dimensions. Thank you.
Thanks, Thank you. As I said, we're going to run continuously and then time at the end for a little panel discussion. Obviously, we're very squeezed for time.
Sorry. Yes, I will do my best. Okay, so go. Thanks for inviting me. This is a great audience. Okay, so I'm gonna spend some time talking a little bit about the economics of education in general, and then jump into school choice, which is what I've been working on. So in economics of education, we've been pretty much stuck using cross-sectional data for a very long time. So only very recently have we had access to school data. Okay, so data about adults, we're fine, and then we ask them how much education they have. That's the data we've been using so far. But now we're actually allowed to go into schools and collect the information that schools have been collected for a long time. But even administrations have been reluctant to collecting those data until very recently. Okay, so for instance, Catalonia, which is the region that I've worked on mostly, started collecting this data in 2009. Okay, so, but the explosion is enormous. So in the last decade, it's pretty amazing how much we've advanced in that sense. And it's not only how much data we've accessed, it's also how much data we've been able to merge and deal with to do research, okay? So in the past, it was basically asking people how many years of education they have, but now we can run, most countries run standardized tests, so we get data on those. We have school records on the grades, the teachers that each of the pupils have had, the attendance or not, whether they've been in trouble or not, all kinds of comments about it of the individuals. We also get access to school choice data, which reports what the family's desires were into what schools that they wanted to go to. And then all of this together merged with other administrative records that give you a background on what the parents of these kids look like, okay? So Northern Europeans were the starters with just this merger of data philosophy, and some of us have tried to follow and learned a lot from their experience in basically establishing protocols for our own countries. So just briefly for returns of education, as I said, we just used cross-sectional data. So all we could say is at a given point in time, people having so many years of education, this is the wage they have, and people having such and such years of education, this is how much wage they have, so the returns of education are such and such. So very limited and very large identification problems that we've tried and overcome with exploiting sources of variation, such as the month of birth, which gives you an exogenous source of variation on when you enter schools, or changes in the laws of when compulsory education finishes, and so on and so forth. Okay, and recently, Magne and his co-authors have used an enormous panel that basically allows you to say, you know, panel of individuals in the last, I don't know how many years in Norway, that allows you to talk about all these different issues and address these issues in a very nice way. And this is pretty much by accessing very rich data, okay? And same for schools and teachers' quality. This is something that we haven't addressed at all for the last, I mean, this is something that is very recent. We're still, I think, trying to get at it. It's not like we have good measures, but we couldn't even start constructing any measures until now because we didn't have any data, okay? So now we have data on We started with having some panels of grades that individuals obtained in different levels from standardized tests, but then those were merged with long-run outcomes, so here we're making some progress. Then we've also started collecting other aspects, not only grades, but other things that are relevant about the educational process of individuals. And then this, together with choice data, has allowed to better identify some of the, or better correct for the selection problems that these measurements were having in the past. But this is very, very recent literature that wouldn't have come about if we didn't even get the data that we're all now accessing. Okay? And this is not only changing, so this is not only changing the questions we can answer, but it's also changing how policymakers view policy design and policy evaluation. So in the past, if you wanted to know about class size and what the optimal class size shall be, you needed to run experiments with, random, convince some schools, run all these tests to all of these schools, and so on and so forth. Whereas now we have organizations that basically, so it's, Minedo is an example in Peru, where it's basically the government saying, give me proposals on randomized controls that I may run. The only condition that I ask you is that you need to be able to evaluate the outcome using all my administrative data. Okay? So this means that we're now getting all these policy experiments done in Peru thanks to just having this access to all this data, and the government collaborating with the researchers to give them the data and to run the specific policies that are in question, okay? So the access to administrative records is hugely changing the set of questions we can answer, but it's also changing how we're gonna do policy evaluation, I think, in the future. Okay, so now I'm gonna jump, let's see. Yes. So I'm gonna jump into school choice, which is how I got even started with doing data analysis. I was basically a theorist in the past. School choice is a policy that has been widely implemented. So if you see the role that economists have had in the education world, it's basically advising for choice. This is basically, it seems like that's the one thing we can do correctly. Okay, well, I said correctly and I'm not even sure. Okay, the arguments are that that's gonna increase access to better schools for disadvantaged families, and it's also gonna put some pressure on schools to compete for demand of the kids. So that's gonna try and make the kids succeed more so that they get elected by the families, okay? But the empirics on this were also very scarce until very recently. So all we could do was basically exploit exogenous variation on how much choice you had given by geographical constraints. Okay, so this, we couldn't say much more than that. Recently, we've exploited, so this Lavi and Hastings and her co-authors have used the implementation of school choice in some cities. So I'm missing here Charlotte. Have used the implementation of such mechanisms to evaluate the impact on choice, but also simultaneously, there's another literature that has said, well, wait a minute, it's not only about whether school choice yes or no, but actually how you implement choice may hugely impact what you get at, okay? And the main issue is that schools have fixed capacity, so you're not gonna be able to assign everybody where they want. And this simple problem of saying, okay, so what am I gonna do? I'm gonna ask people what they want, and if there's a conflict of, if there's conflict, there's over demand for certain schools, what do I do? Okay, depending on what you do, families may actually not even tell you what they really want. Okay, so it becomes like, as to economists, once you face it like that, you're like, okay, you're trying to elicit something. Of course, depending on what you do with those elicited preferences, you're gonna get people telling you different things. That's not surprising, but it is it was somehow surprising in that environment where you're just on, yeah. Okay, anyway, so depending on the norms used, people may not report their preferences truthfully, and one of the big issues that I'm not going to talk about, but I hope you can believe me, one of the important issues in affecting the final allocation is that when you have over-demand for a certain school, you have to prioritize individuals using some criteria. Some countries just use a random lottery, to rank people. Some people use grades, but if you're talking about age 3, maybe that doesn't make sense. Some people use whether you live in the neighborhood or not. Okay, so for age 3, that's the most common criteria used. Well, those specific rules, which to the literature for now have been like this is exogenous thing given to the designer, have a huge impact on the final allocation. Okay. And it will not only have an impact on how happy the parents are, but it will have an impact on where people go to school, where people live, and so on and so forth more broadly, okay? So these are the 2 issues that I am gonna try and discuss how data have helped us provide some answers to these questions, or will provide some answers to these questions. The first is, well, do families report preferences truthfully? Well, there's a challenge there. Preferences is something we cannot observe. So how are you going to say that people are not reporting their true preferences? Are you going to create another game to elicit those preferences, and then what are you going to do? Okay. So one initial thing that we were able to do was we were sort of convinced that preferences were not so important, but that these priorities that I just mentioned, like the neighborhood, whether you live in the neighborhood or not, affected the behavior under some of these mechanisms. And unfortunately, we had that in Barcelona. There had been some exogenous variation in the design of those norms, which allowed us to answer those questions. Okay, so we saw that families did not, when those priorities changed, so the neighborhood design of the city changed, people systematically changed what they applied for, which provides some evidence that they're not being completely truthful in the sense that they're not just ranking their preferences truthfully, but they're somehow strategizing and solving a complex problem, okay? For that means we were accessing choice data, assignment, enrollment data, the zoning maps of the city, and all of this merged with census data that gave us parents' characteristics. Okay, and this is to us our first and most important, how do you say this? Challenge resolved. Like this is our first big breakthrough in the sense that after this everything was easier because we had a good, like we already had established a contract and a protocol through which we can access this data, and then expanding from this was relatively easy, okay? Like getting this first step done required a lot more, and consulting people from Sweden, Norway, and all these people to convince the authorities that what we're doing was doable, okay? So this is the first merger of data on education with data outside of the Department of Education. Okay, but so that first step of showing that people do not tell the truth was like, okay, fine, but then what? I mean, okay, people don't tell the truth. Is this good or bad? Is it, so shall we worry and implement a mechanism that does force everybody to tell the truth or not? And so to do that, to do this kind of counterfactual analysis, you're not happy enough just showing that priorities have a huge impact on choice, but you actually want to get at true preferences. And then to get at that, asking is not going to get to that. What we do is sort of understand the complete problem that the parents are solving, and for that you need a lot of data on the probabilities of accessing. Sorry, I did not know it would make that big sound, sorry. So anyway, so here we needed the complete set of the problem that families were solving so that we could structurally estimate preferences and run the counterfactual, which was extremely useful because we actually showed that the change in Barcelona to the strategy proof, whatever mechanism, would not have been good for us, okay? So, and then from that, so I'm gonna cut it short, but basically, I also told you that these priorities have a huge impact on schools and on and the landscape of neighborhoods and so on. So presumably the governments are gonna have preferences over those allocations, and the way they have, the instrument they have to affect those allocations is precisely through the design of these priorities. So what we're trying to do now is understand what the government's problem looks like in terms of the design problem, and how are they choosing those priorities to implement what shall be their desired outcome, okay? And the first question we try to answer is, what do governments want? And to get at that, so I just wanted to be able to say that to get at that question, you need similar governments solving similar problems. And so we get data from all of Catalonia, which means 500 municipalities all under the same law, but each one being able to design those priorities. So we're trying to back out the preferences of the governments from this kind of data. Okay? So this means lots of data. That means not only lots of data, though, it also means lots of theory, it means lots of econometrics, and it means lots of everything, okay? So, but the data is something that you needed to start with. Otherwise, all of the rest wouldn't have made sense. And all of this happened after the first data set was collected. Expanding from there to this was pretty trivial in the sense that it was just, oh, it's again the same thing. And then we established a protocol through which now everybody can do that and apply for this kind of data. So I think I'm gonna stop here because my
Magne. We have to give an example of even a theorist turning to empirics in the light of big data.
Who's this one?
Now the story from Norway. By Chicago.
I will ask you to speak more the microphone.
Sure.
So
Can you put it on the screen?
you only appear at that time.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Richard, for putting me on the program. So I wasn't sure what to talk about when Richard gave me the title. So there's not talk about big data in social science. Some refer to admin data as big data. I think that's a pretty bad description and doesn't really get across what's unique about admin data. So admin data, I think, can be described by data collected by public agencies or other administrative units for the purpose of administration. So not collected for research. That creates some challenges, but it also opens up some new opportunities for research, which I want to talk a little bit about. I think once you start thinking about admin data, it's just data coming from admin units. It also, I think, helps think about what might be the possible advantages and what might be the possible challenges. So what are the characterizing features of admin data? Usually they tend to be two things. You get very large samples of population level data. And the other thing is that you often have unique identifiers that help you link different data sets. So those seem to be pretty narrow advantages. They might be useful, but they're definitely not as useful as sometimes is argued. They're not going to help you or be a substitute for writing down models. It's not going to help you solve an identification problem. Matching and selection of observables is just as bad with a large N as a small N. It's not going to help you, and if anything, it's going to make it worse, because often admin data have relatively few variables. They might be high dimension, but it's often relatively sparse in terms of variables, but large in terms of observations. So for me, at least, the two sort of main attractions to admin data, and why we spent a lot of time investing in them, is that it allows you to study subgroups, and it allows you to make these linkages. So you might argue, why do we care about subgroups? I think sometimes subgroups are of intrinsic interest. So if Raj Chetty's work where he describes mobility across the US, the whole point there is to actually understand how much variation there is spatially in mobility. He really cares about the subgroups in and of themselves. In other settings, the subgroups, and I'll show you an example, are actually key to determining the market level outcomes. There are a few actors or agents that really has a big impact on what we really care about in aggregates. So I think subgroups might be interesting and it might be useful, and admin data allows us to see those more clearly than before. The other thing is that we can do these linkages across different data sets, helping to bring in more variables and to get more dimensions to look at in the data. So instead of talking more generally about these things, I want to give you like two examples from our own research, where these two advantages were important for starting these projects, and I think also useful for getting some new answers. And as I go along, I might be trying to sort of highlight some of the challenges that working with admin data actually introduces. The first one is ongoing work using US IRS data together with John Nist. So the IRS data in the US is basically like the tax return data you have in Norway and other countries, where you can see the tax returns of all firms and workers. One thing we were interested in is trying to study So a topic John has been working a lot on is charitable giving, the donations. So in the US, that makes up 2% of the GDP. So first when I started this project, I thought, who cares about donations? In the US, it's big. It's a big sector of the economy. And it's one sector we know very little about. The problem, the key reason for that is that what we have is our surveys, and the surveys do not contain the very rich that gives. If you understand this market, I'll just show you in the next few slides, you want to know the behavior of the Bill Gates and the Mark Zuckerbergs, and not people like us, because we give relatively little. And the other thing is that the surveys do not contain enough information about all types of givings. So when I think about giving, I think about donating cash. Well, it turns out for rich people, what they're donating mostly is stocks. And again, admin data gives you access to that because I have to report this to the tax authorities. So let me show you the importance of admin data in this setting as a way to illustrate how subgroups, the very rich, might be super useful to look at if you understand a market, in this case, donations. Okay, so for those who are interested, the tax return data in the US is pretty much like in Europe. It's been harder to access, but now more and more people have access to it. And you have third-party forms that capture incomes of non-filers, and you're able to link, at least to some extent, family members and workers to firms. So this is what basically a survey data would tell you about giving, which is also the seen in the IRS data. This is the proportion of the total giving by percentile in the income distribution. So here I show you the distribution for the 98% poorest. So I'm not showing you the richest 1%. Okay, so it sort of looks like what you would expect to see, except for the zeros. There are some very rich, wealthy people with low income that gives quite a bit. So this is pretty much a starting point for our project and a lot of John's work. And we're sort of curious, how much are really the rich people giving? So you might sort of zoom in for the richest, or 95th percentile to 98th percentile, and see that it looks pretty linear. So maybe it's not such a big issue that we don't see the Mark Zuckerbergs and Bill Gates. Maybe we can just extrapolate and use that as a way to get towards factual. We can do it linearly, we can do it quadratically, and you get that the rich people give something like 7 to 8% of the total giving. That turns out to be a very bad approximation. Here's the giving of the richest 1%. And this is how far you're off if we were to use the survey data. So this is the rest of the distribution, and then we go to the richest 1% that gives about 45% of the total giving in the US. So you might think that we maybe just do some survey, oversample the rich people like we try to do in expenditure surveys and wealth surveys. Maybe that's the way to go about this. So let's look at the richest 1%. Who's giving there? It's really the richest 0.1%. So what about the richest 0.1%? Was really the richest 0.01%, and so on and so forth. So this is sort of example where if you want to understand this market, I think you really want to look at the very rich people. And I don't see any substitute except for using admin data, having information about these people. So everything I showed you is for Illinois, and we're going to do it for the whole US, but IRS don't have a very good service. We have to do it's more slowly than I'm used to. So it's probably going to look something like this also for the rest of the US. Over time, top income earners are giving more and more, becoming increasingly important. Another point is that admin data, because it's collected for admin purposes, in this case tax purposes, they collect much broader set of information about giving. The Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg are not going to tell you about how much stocks they give and what kind of stocks. They have to do that for the IRS. So is that important? Well, this is the fractional giving at the percentile. That's in terms of cash and stocks. And carryover, if you took that in, it would be 100%. You see, for most people, we don't give stocks. What about the rich people? Start crossing among the very rich. Zooming in on those, more and more stocks. And among the very, very rich, what they basically give is stocks. Why? Because there are very strong tax incentives to give stocks instead of cash. So again, if you understand this market, you understand the role of taxes, you really want to zoom in on the very rich, you really want to think about what they can give, which other people may not be able to give. And that's what we're trying to do in the project now, and we've been trying to do for a while. Try to describe who gives and what levels, including the people that really matters for this market, the very rich. Understand how tax policy and business cycle affect when people give and how much they give. And particularly think about the extent to which interventions or tax changes trying to incentivize giving is just crowding out future giving, or just shifting the giving across donations, or if it increases total giving. But to me, this was kind of a striking example of working with this and see how far off my priors were about this market and how important it was to look at the people that in this case matter to understand the equilibrium outcomes, the very rich. Let me spend, we have 5 more minutes. A little bit on another example. Of course, there are many other people who do work on admin data, much better work than me, but it's much easier for me to make the slides based on my presentation, so I'm going to do that here too. And in this case, we want to think about, try to illustrate the usefulness of linking data. So for a long time, Gordon Dahl, me, and Andrea were thinking about a way to get at the question of whether welfare dependency in one generation was causing welfare dependency in the next generation. We started with some fixed effects models, selection of observables, but we really weren't very happy about this. And there were 2 things that were hard. The first one was that we need to get access to data, a long panel of data, which is large enough that allows us to follow both kids and parents over time and look at the welfare participation. So we had that because we had access to Norwegian admin data. The second problem is you need to be able to link those data to some sort of shifter of parents in and out of DI. Okay, so we were reading a paper by Nicole Maestas and Eric French, two different papers, using the assignment of cases to judges in the US as a way to, in the disability insurance system, as a way to get an exogenous shifter of people's participation on disability insurance. So we thought, let's try to do that. Let's try to go to the disability courts, which is where this happens in Norway, try to convince them to link this data to the admin data. So we have a shifter and we have this long panel data. Turned out to be pretty hard, but eventually we got there. We had, I think, one of the first opportunities to look at this long-standing question about welfare dependency in and of itself is causing welfare dependency in the next generation. So surprisingly, a lot of people have very strong opinions about this. Gary Becker was entirely convinced that welfare dependency was causal and was important. Bush was also convinced by this. Researchers were much less convinced. It's a very nice review by Black and Devereux, arguing that there's a very strong correlation in welfare dependency across generation. We know very little about whether it's causal or not, and what mechanisms might generate it. So that motivated our paper. We were asked 2 questions, or we were motivated by 2 questions. First of all, is there welfare culture? Is it the case that if I exogenously make parents go on disability insurance, does that increase the probability that kids go on the program? And if so, what mechanisms is it working through? So what do we do? Well, as I told you, we tried to exploit this policy that randomized the probability that parents receive welfare. What exactly was that? Well, the way the DI system works in Norway, just like in the US, is that you first apply for DI and you get assigned to a case examiner. At this point, there's not really a randomization. They specialize in different disorders and so on and so forth. Most people who have a hard to verify disorder, like back pain and mental illness, get rejected immediately. So in that, many of those people appeal that decision, and you get to the second layer of the determination process, the court system. At this point, by law in Norway, you have random assignment of cases to different judges. So what's nice about that is you can use the random assignment, first of all, to estimate consistently the leniency of the judge, because in large sample, they're all going to get the same type of cases. So any difference in the leniency must come from the judge and not the cases they get. The other thing is it breaks correlation between the characteristics of the applicants and the kids and the probability of getting a strict judge because of random assignment. So that allows us to do IV. So you can just show that in 2 graphs. The first one here shows the leniency of the judge to which the parent is assigned. This is the probability of the parent going on DI. Here's the distribution of judges. So because of this admin data, that we have all judges and all cases in Norway, each of those judges handle at least 300 cases. So this is not small sample variation. So what does this show me? Some judges almost never allow people. Some judges allow as much as 25 to 30%. And if you happen to be assigned to a lenient judge, you're much less likely to get DI than if you happen to be assigned to a strict judge. So that's not very surprising for the parents. What's interesting is that it also carries over to the kids. This is not the judge of the kid, it's the judge of the parent. If the parent happens to be assigned to a lenient judge, then they're much more likely, the kid is much more likely to be on welfare, or in this case disability insurance, 20 years later, than if the parent happens to be assigned to a strict judge. Okay, you take the ratio of those 2, and you have a 2 SLS estimate, and that's going to be the IV effect, the exogenous effect of parents being on DI, and the probability of the kid being on DI. So what do we see? Well, this is among kids who are eligible, they have to be at least 18. So in the beginning, the effect is very, very small, only 1 percentage point increase if the parent is going on DI because of a lenient judge. Over time, as the kids get older, and they're more likely to be applying anyway, the effect grows and ends up explaining, or ends up being 1/10 as big as the direct effect on parents. So if I randomly make parent go on DI, the kid is 10% more likely to be on DI 10 years later. Okay, so let me just wrap up. So through these two examples, I tried to sort of briefly describe why we spend a lot of time trying to access and work with and deal with the problems of admin data. And it's clearly not a magic bullet. You still have issues. Some issues are even more salient now. This data is collected for research, so measurement error might be much more of a problem, at least much in some dimensions. So what we have found is that the variables that the government use are very well measured. Earnings, taxes, and so on. The variables they don't really care about, like hours, is very poorly measured. Why? Because the taxes are not based on hours. They collect taxes hours, but they don't really monitor it or enforce it. So it creates interesting issues about measurement error and non-classical measurement error. And so that's one thing that requires a lot of investments in data to figure out. The other thing is also the sheer size of the data, as was illustrated in the last talk, creates issues about how to store, manage, and analyze them. And I think sort of what we've been thinking more and more is that what this means is that a large fixed cost of actually getting access to and working with this data, which means they're increasing return to scale, which means that you probably want to work with people who know the data, or you want to have co-authorship, or you want to start investing with people who work at statistical agencies. And it probably has some implication for ERC and other funding agencies too. And you probably want to start prioritizing funding large-scale research labs instead of individual projects when it comes to applied research.
Great, thanks. We'll be done by 2, so don't worry. I think. Andrea, thank you.
Thank you.
You might want to stand in front of the microphone, because otherwise.
Thanks. So thanks for coming. This is a talk about using administrative data to model mobility across countries in Europe. And this is also a talk much more basic maybe than the preceding two ones, because I'm talking about the problems of getting access to this data and generating data in the first place. So this results from a joint project with Rodolf Winterebner at the University of Linz and colleagues from the IAB in Germany. If you think about individual mobility in Europe, this has been a very controversial policy topic recently. The European Union wants to foster free mobility of workers, and preceding the European Union, there was this Nordic labor market which was established in the 1950s, which also allowed for free mobility across countries. But there is relatively little information about what this mobility is creating. So there is, if you look at data about migrants in countries, the information is not complete. So you can see migrants when they register coming into the country. You can also see them if they work in the country and if they participate in social programs. But what is usually not registered is if they leave the country or if they temporarily leave the country. So there's huge gaps in these migrant careers. And in order to fully get a picture of this migration behavior, we would optimally want to have data from multiple countries. In terms of the registered database, this would mean merging registers across countries. So not to focus on a single country, but to merge registers from multiple countries. And this is a task that has not been yet very extensively pursued. So there are some data sets which link, again, Nordic countries, where it's relatively easy to have personal identifiers. But for the rest of Europe, this is completely new land. So as we saw before, we observed the full population of workers. So we observed the full foreign nationals. but we don't know anything about those moving across countries in the registered data typically. So we use, or we plan to use Austria and Germany as our starting point and model countries, and combine those data sets. So the advantage of using those two countries is that they have a common language, they have very similar educational systems, and they also have very similar institutions, so there should be a lot of mobility. So in terms of the data issues, if you look at Austria and Germany, so we don't have a common individual identifier. So to link these individuals across countries, we have to go by their names and their birth dates. And this is where the problems with getting access to this data really start. So names and birth dates are very, very sensitive information, even within the country. But if you want to export them across countries, then the legal issues really start. We've been working on this project since 2012, when the first negotiations started. And we're still not there, so we still don't have the data. So every time I get asked, I say in half a year we will have some data, but so far we still don't have any data. So the problem is that the legal environment, although it is Austria and Germany and they are very similar countries, is in fact quite different. So the IAB came up to us and gave us a contract which should be signed by the Austrian Social Security Administration, and we brought this contract there and they said, we don't sign contracts, we only make informal agreements. So it took us the longest time to get these two authorities to negotiate or agree on a contract. Now this contract is there, and the next problem is to export this data physically from one country to the next, to the other. So the Germans wanted to set up a very, very secure server where the Austrians could download information about Austrian citizens who are in the German administrative data. But this was so secure that the Austrians didn't manage to access this. So finally, they sent the data on a CD with a bodyguard. We run into troubles at every step of this data generating process. So we recently reapplied for funding for this project, and I put together a list of all the email conversations starting in 2012. And it's not that this project lay dormant for years. So every few months there was either a meeting or an email request or something or other. So this has been going on work continuously, more or less, and still does, hopefully. Yeah? Why would this be interesting at all? Why would we want to know anything about this mobility between Germany and Austria? Maybe this is not interesting. So what I can show you is the information about German nationals who appear in the Austrian administrative data. And so here this is people employed in Austria. If you look over time, starting with the 1990s, it seemed to be a low share of, this is the share of Germans working in Austria, about 1%, and it seemed to be very, very stable. Even when Austria joined the European Union in 1995, there was no big change. But starting with 2000 or in the early 2000s, the number of Germans coming to Austria has increased tremendously. And then we see that it goes back down after the Great Recession. Yeah? So there seem to be lots of things going on about which we have no clue at all, about which we have no data and no information. So it would be really great to find out more. So this downward sloping thing here seems to indicate that these people really don't migrate permanently from Germany to Austria, but they go back. And if you look at the thing by industries, there's even more indication that there is a temporary or a return migration. So this is the tourism industry, basically, which makes where the German immigrants make up a share of more than 10% in good years. The next one is the transport industry, which is also a huge contributor. And all these industries are highly seasonal, so they typically have temporary jobs. So what we think is that it would be very interesting to analyze this migratory behavior across countries. So what motivates workers to move to the other country? Do they gain relative to workers who stay, so we could compare counterfactual situations. We can investigate the role of the institutional environment. Well, the environment in Austria has been relatively stable over time. In Germany, they introduced, for instance, big labor market reforms, the Hartz reforms. And also we saw in Germany that there is this huge expansion of the low-wage sector with lots of firms offering low-wage jobs coming in. So these workers might have found better opportunities in Austria and moved across the border. And then, of course, we also would like to know what is the role of the business cycle. So these are all the research questions we finally want to address. There's many more. If you think about the institutional framework, you can, of course, also think about social security regulations. Do they hinder mobility or foster mobility, things like this. And if we look at the future, even though we don't even have yet the data on Austria and Germany, we can still fantasize on how to expand. So it would be very exciting to have to take more countries on board. So for instance, know something about the migration from Hungary to Austria, which is huge, or other Eastern European countries, or just other neighboring states. And the final goal would be to have a complete European labor market picture of migratory flows across all countries. A data set which we, for instance, have for trade, but which we don't have for labor. Thank you very much.
Well, we have exactly 2 minutes till the end, so I'm going to. So one point of setting this up was to reflect really the importance of data, and you've seen it all the way through, but it's more or less the key now to getting a top publication and to having an influence to be involved in the use of data of this kind. So it's particularly important, and as we saw, we've even got theorists moving into empirics, many sides. So this is important. The research committee would like to provide a hub in Europe for somehow coordinating this activity, and the idea was to take 4 examples and think about how we might do that. One thing that obviously came up as Magne was speaking is the idea of a laboratory. Of course, we'd like to do that, but is there a way of creating something more like a virtual laboratory of information sharing? So certainly we'd like to create some hub for information that we can continuously update and get people feeding into, and of course use to exploit when they're thinking about applying for ERC or other grants. Given the time, it's going to be difficult, I think, to run a whole panel session now, with the 10 minutes was used up. But I'd still like to give opportunity for anybody to raise points or for any comments back among the speakers. So first, is there anyone who has any kind of observation or comment that they'd like to raise at this point? There'll be opportunities in future through the research committee of the EEA to do that, either electronically through the web, or perhaps we'll run a follow-up meeting at the next meeting. But if you've got some ideas, if anyone's got a burning idea or a question they'd like to raise, can I see it? Anyone? It's probably not the right environment for this. I can see that. Any reflections from the panel would like to? So at the moment, we don't really have a good idea how to set this up. This is just, we know this is absolutely key for making sure research in economics in Europe is really hitting the very top level. For much of applied research, you just have to be thinking about research designs and data along the lines that we've heard from these 4. And so we know that's an activity we must help and push, and the idea, we're going to have a research committee meeting after this to try and think about how to activate that in a kind of coherent way. Is there anything anybody would like to reflect here? Okay, we're up to time. Would the president like to say anything? No, okay. There's a theorist who's also become an empirical economist, so there you are, it can happen. Okay, so thanks again to the 4 speakers. That's incredibly useful, and taking us forward, I know we're going to ask these 4 to become important members of that, so thank you.